Okay, am I audible? Apologies for those who were actually on here a bit earlier. I had some technical issues. The slideshow for some reason was not working, so I'm going to restart and going to now show you all. Hopefully this works this time. Okay, let me start from the top. Hello everyone and welcome to Through the Looking Glass. Episode 3, What Should Be Done About Arab Nationalism in Syria. Welcome to the third episode of Through the Looking Glass, TTLG, a podcast examining issues related to foreign policy, foreign affairs, and current global affairs. Examining current global affairs and reflecting on pressing questions and providing thoughts from a young adult's perspective, taking a look at this confusing world through the looking glass. My name is Anthony Bisson. I am a freelance writer and contributor to the Jerusalem Post, Arab Magazine, and The Region. My areas of focus are the Middle East, specifically on minority rights, as well as conflict analysis that I write about, and foreign policy. To sort of preface this, this will not be an exhaustive history of Syria. I'm only going to be starting from 1865 onwards, and we'll only be covering elements important for historical context on the rise of Arab nationalism in Syria. So with this said, I'll be also placing links to all the sources that I've used throughout this presentation at the end of the stream. The stream should roughly go between 2 to 2.5 hours. And yes, so without further ado, let's begin this episode of Through the Looking Glass. Episode 3, What Should Be Done About Arab Nationalism in Syria. Now hopefully if this slideshow is actually working, you should be able to see currently a map of Syria. Now before I go on, I'm just going to check that myself. It should be working. I think it must be working. Let's see, because it should be the second slide should be, yes, okay, it's working. So, now let's get back to it. Now, where to start when it comes to Syria? For all those of you who don't know what Syria looks like, here it is on a map. The capital is Damascus. It's around about 5 countries: Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Iraq, and Turkey. Now, we're going to be starting specifically in 1865, because rather than going all the way back to Mesopotamians or the Byzantiums and so on, I'd rather have a specific focus because this gives us a bit of context into the rise of Arab nationalism, specifically in Syria. So let's begin. So, Syria used to be owned, you could say, by the Ottoman Empire. It used to be under something called a vilayet, or the vilayet of Syria. Now, for all of those of you who don't know what a vilayet is, a vilayet was part of the Tanzimat reforms that were pushed through to the Ottoman Empire. What are the Tanzimat reforms, you may ask? Is the reforms that were placed to try and modernize the Ottoman Empire, to bring it away from this like medieval structure to a more decentralized, more politically plural empire. Now, with the Sanjak of, the vilayet of Syria, is it has minor Sanjaks underneath it. So it has the Sanjak of Damascus, Hama, Horon, and Man. And pardon me for butchering the pronunciation. I'm still learning Arabic currently, so I'm a native English speaker. It's not going to be exactly perfect with every single bit of pronunciation. Now, with the vilayet, it would have a vilayet appointed by the Sultan to govern the area of Syria. Now, just to give you a sort of like a map look of it, here's the Ottoman Empire between 1774 and 1914. At its height, it would stretch right to Morocco, as well as consume parts of the Balkans, right up to the coast, also southward of Yemen, and also just to the south of Egypt. Now, this is a very important map to understand just what Syria looked like underneath this empire. As you can see, there's no discernible borders that have been established. You would only have a minor vilayet, which is next to that of the Musaferet of Jerusalem, amongst many other sanjaks that were established by the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so let's start this at the beginning. Now we're going to start this really at the crumbling of the Ottoman Empire, because I think it's important, because this gives us context for the rise of Arab nationalism in the areas of the Middle East. So we're going to start with the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Now, prior to this, the Ottoman Empire actually had been a good ally of countries like Britain and France and that, but despite the last couple of decades prior to the First World War, tensions had arose between these powers, and when this all culminated essentially in the First World War, where in the First World War the Ottoman Empire took the side of the Central Powers, that's notably the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire, whereas it was versus the Allies, led of course by Britain, France, and France and Russia, and later the United States. Now, prior to this, the British actually wanted to keep the integrity of the Ottoman Empire upheld. However, when the Ottoman Empire decided to side with the Central Powers during the First World War, plans between Russia and France to divvy up the regions underneath the Ottoman Empire were made. Now, this was made through correspondence between two individuals. These two individuals were Mark Sykes, who was a British negotiator, and the French, or counterpart to this guy, Francois Picot, in 1915. Prior to that, there had been actual Arab movements within Syria, and as well as the rest of the Ottoman Empire at that time, discussing about the future of the Ottoman Empire, what to be done about the growing pluralism within the Ottoman Empire. How should we deal with minority issues, and how should we deal with the Arab population? You would have some groups emerging from this, such as the Ottoman Arab Brotherhood, which would be formed in 1908 and later form into the Arab Congress in Paris in 1913. These individuals wanted to promote greater Arab rights within the Ottoman Empire without necessarily seceding from the Ottoman Empire. That used to be the majority. These were called like Ottomans, you could say, like Ottoman supporters, whereas a small minority of them were actually Arabists, or people who were actually pushing for an independent Arab state. Now, notable of these many different Arab societies that was underneath the Ottoman Empire, you would have two main ones that we need to draw attention to. The first, the Young Arab Society, and the second is the Covenant Society. Young Arab Society, otherwise known as Al-Fatah, and the Covenant Society, or Al-Ahad. In this region, these two groups would be discussing about greater autonomy for the Arab people under the Ottoman Empire, and forming negotiations with a new emir, so not a new emir, but a well-known emir by the name of Sayyid al-Hussein ibn Ali, who was the emir of Mecca, or the Sharif of Mecca, if you want to call it that way. He was also the king of the Kingdom of Hajjaj. Now, in the early days of 1915, the British tried to invade Gallipoli via the Australians. This is the famous Gallipoli offensive led by Churchill. The whole aim was to try and pressure the Ottoman Empire into a quick surrender. However, due to the failure of that invasion, the British became very hesitant of going further into the Ottoman Empire without some form of local support and some form of support from the French. So notable of this would be coming from people like Sykes and Picot, who would negotiate over what to do about a potential, quote-unquote, divvying up of this region. This would sort of lay the groundwork for something called the French Mandate later on, but we'll get to that soon enough. So, let's get on. Now, prior to this, during this time period, King Hussein at the time, well, not King Hussein, I should say, Sayyid Hussein ibn Ali, along with these two sons, Ali and, of course, Faisal, organized a rebellion against the Ottoman Empire. In exchange, actually, and this is in the core, we have this from records and that of something called the Damascus Protocol, where the British would back an Arab state if the Arabs, led by at that time Hussein and Faisal, notably, would come and rebel against the Ottoman Empire. This was, of course, we would know this as the if you know like T.E. Lawrence's Lawrence of Arabia, this is where they come in, back in 1916. Now, the whole aim was that the British would guarantee, the British and French actually, would guarantee some form of Arab state to these Arabs if they would revolt against their Ottoman rulers, which they did, which led, of course, to the siege of Damascus and the expulsion of the Ottomans. However, being the British and the French, as they usually tend to be, they had other arrangements which were made during the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The Sykes-Picot Agreement would divide or divvy up the Ottoman territories between French influence and British influence. The French would get Syria and Greater Lebanon, as well as parts of Mosul, while the British would get the rest, Transjordan, Palestine, Iraq. Now, at that time, the British were backing heavily Faisal bin Ali, or Faisal Hussein bin Ali, as you could say, a puppet for them to gain influence in the area. During this time, there became a sort of a quasi-state called the Kingdom of Syria, and this is actually due to sort of like a miscommunication between Sir Henry McMahon and Hussein bin Ali, because Henry McMahon, who was a British official, told Hussein that the British would back him in establishing their own Arab state, and this is what Faisal and Hussein would do with creating, of course, the Kingdom of Syria in 1918. However, the British, after pressure from both the French and also the Russians, withdrew their support to this kingdom, because there was sort of like a de facto kingdom that was occupying parts of Iraq, that was under the control of the Hashemites. Sayyid Hussein and Faisal Hussein are part of the Hashemite family. The Hashemite family are one of, you could say, the most important families in the Middle East. I mean, you could see Abdullah II is the descendant of Hussein and Ali and Faisal. So the Hashemites claim ownership, or they used to claim ownership of Iraq and parts of Saudi Arabia, and they profess to be the descendants of Muhammad. And they wanted, for example, a kingdom, and they thought that the British would deliver that to them on a silver platter. However, the British and the French had other ideas about this. So this correspondence, known as the McMahon and Hussein correspondence, culminated essentially into this mistake that the British would back the state. And after French pressure, the British withdrew their support, and the French actually came into something called the Franco-Syrian War, which essentially helped to capture Damascus back from Hussein's forces. During this time as well, other declarations were put into place, such as the Balfour Declaration by the British in 1917, which guaranteed the independence of a Jewish state in the region of Palestine today. Now, I just want to make something very clear. Not all nationalists supported Hussein. There were some nationalists, for example, who were fine with the British and the French arrangement. Especially there was a lot of Syrian nationalists who were actually fine with the French arrangement, because they thought that the French arrangement would guarantee them some form of autonomy for Arabs. However, this, of course, the support slowly rescinded when the French became to be known as quite cruel rulers in that area. So let's see. This is actually an old picture from, and this is the Kingdom of Syria. This is like an old picture from the 1920s. I believe it's a 1920 book, I believe. Very interesting events. Yeah. Now, it brings us to the more important things, because I must say that I'm not going to be doing extensive history on this. This is not the reason why I've made this video. This video is specifically meant to try and give some historical context to current events within Syria and the rise of Arab nationalism. So it's very important to know this side of history, because it gives us understanding of how the Syrian state came to be and the influence of British and French on the prospects of that. Now, I told you all about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was essentially a secret agreement made between Sykes and Picot to divvy up the Middle East. Now, part of this ascension of this agreement came in the form of what is known as the Mandate for Syria and Greater Lebanon, which was put into force by the League of Nations at that time in 1923. It's one of the first things that they did, besides a bunch of other things. This actually came after I believe, the San Remo conference in 1920, which actually acknowledged, you could say, French influence in Syria. So you kind of get the impression that the British and French weren't really interested in negotiating with the locals too much. The British were more interested in keeping their own puppets, notably Farouk in Egypt, and later on, I should say, in Egypt, and Faisal in Iraq. Actually, Faisal became, quote-unquote, king in Iraq. Whereas the French were more, they wanted to, initially they were open to the idea of having essentially Syrians govern their own areas. However, when more of their interests became intertwined with other nations, they kind of became much more assertive, especially when the Arabs started to revolt more against their rulership. Because the French did not like that. It took them actually nearly 3 years, because throughout 3 years, from 1920 to 1923, there were a ton of revolts. And even after that, there were a ton of revolts, right until 1930 and that. Because the fact of the matter is that French influence was new to this area, especially in that part of the world. The Ottomans themselves had kind of governed, as I said before, the Tanzimat reforms from afar a bit, ever since 1860s. Now, Syrians felt that their chance of independence, if you will, was being ruined by imperial powers. This brings us to not only this mandate, but also the Treaty of Sevres. Now, the Treaty of Sevres, for those of you who don't know, was a treaty signed between Greece, Britain, France, Russia, and just the last echelons, if you will, of the Ottoman Empire, which would divvy up part of the Ottoman Empire. And as you can see, the French mandate and British mandate is the first time it gets to be recognized there outside of the San Remo conference in 1920. Now, of course, the Treaty of Sevres only acknowledged French mandate and British mandate. However, it didn't sort of acknowledge other parts of what would happen to the Ottoman Empire. That was actually replaced by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, after, of course, Ataturk decides, along with a bunch of other Turks, that, you know, they're not going to be submissive towards imperial powers, and they sort of retook their country, or at least at the time retook their nation from imperial powers who were divvying it up amongst themselves. But nothing changed in terms of the French mandate and the British mandate. Now let's go to the Treaty of Sevres, San Remo. Okay, let's see. Now, just to give you sort of like a bit of an understanding of what Syria was like back in those days, late 1920s, early 1930s, is we have various different populations within Syria. We have majority of them being Sunni Arabs, with the second being Kurds, Druze, Shias, Maronites, Circassians, Ismaili, Yazidis, Turks, Assyrians, Greeks, so on and so forth. Syria is a very diverse country. It has a lot of different ethnicities, which is very important to know, because when we go into later about Arab nationalism, you'll see how the Syrian Arab Ba'athists tried to make Syria an Arab state, or attempted to make it a Syrian Arab state, and it's sort of like put this ideology of Ba'athism into institutions, but we'll get to that later. So that's to give you a good idea of just how diverse the state really was. And this is what the French also had to deal with. The French had to deal with huge different populations. I mean, I'll give you an example. During the French mandate of Syria, so this is how France divvied up essentially in the initial days of the French mandate. They divvied up the Sanjak, sort of the Alexandretta district, which had a population of Kurds as well as Turks there. They also divvied up between the state of Aleppo, state of Damascus, Jabhat al-Druze state, the Alawite state, the Golan Heights, and Greater Lebanon. Okay. Now, all of this was under the French mandate. The Alawite state seceded from the rest of this little conglomeration of states for a bit, while the French tried to negotiate with the Syrians in Damascus to try grant some form of autonomous rights. And of course, this was not forthcoming, because the French themselves instituted a lot of military, you could say, how I can put it, military rule in certain areas, especially in like Damascus and Aleppo. Yeah. So let's go, in 1925, for example, there's a Druze uprising. It's led by Sultan Pasha, and it goes from 1925 to 1927. the Sultan wanted an independent Druze state because there's a huge Druze population in the south of the country, and that's very important to know because that feeds into things later on. This all comes together and all makes sense in the long run, but it's important to establish the history of these individual groups to show you that it was not just Arabs, for example, who were hating. It was not just Sunni Arabs, or you could say they were hating the French. It was a lot of different population groups within Syria. You could say from 1925 to 1927, even to 1930, you have a lot of different rebellions going on throughout the country that become a sort of a problem for the French. So much so that in 1930, a push for independence begins. This brings us to the National Bloc and a man by the name of Hashem al-Attasi. So during this time period, there were internal changes going on within Syria. The new Constituent Assembly came to fruition in 1928 and sort of brought about subtle changes in terms of governmental changes in Syria. At that time, the French had their own little puppet in Syria governing the area, whereas you had different parties within the Syrian parliament that were also operating, one of these being the National Bloc. And a man by the name of Hashem al-Attasi, he's the man, if you can see with the white beard in that, he's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, like 7 from the left or 3 from the right. He's next to the guy with the hat. You'll see him up there. Now, Hashem al-Attasi actually pressured the Syrian government, so the Syrian puppet government, to not acquiesce to the French and to push for negotiations of independence, because Syria wanted to be its own independent state. So this all culminates in 1936 with the National Bloc and al-Attasi heading Franco-Syrian Treaty of Independence. So he sort of heads it and negotiates terms on what is classed as independence. What was not classed as independence would be the Great Lebanon, because for the French actually valued Lebanon more than the rest of Syria, especially for its resources and for its rich, you could say, coast and that. So the French had more invested in Lebanon than they did in Syria, but still they occupied these territories nonetheless, because if you know anything about French colonialism, they're not really great colonial leaders, let's put it lightly. I mean, there's atrocities committed by the French against the Arabs, and especially in the way that they crushed revolts as well. They would often shell whole cities and would also publicly hang those responsible for the revolts they had to crush. This brings us to a man by the name of Michel Aflaq. Now, who is Michel Aflaq? Michel Aflaq is a man born in Damascus. He is a Christian Arab, and he is one of the central founders of the Ba'athist ideology. Notably, he is a Syrian Arab Christian, and initially he starts off, as a lot of Syrians at the time do, a lot of Syrian intellectuals, he starts off teaching, but also starts to engage in communist groups and starts to write about the oppression of the French. Because at that time, communism, or you could say how Michel Aflaq viewed communism, was in association to its anti-imperialism towards, of course, the French, who were at that time viewed as the main aggressors for Syria. So Aflaq establishes a party. He establishes the Arab Ihah movement in 1940. Okay, this will be important to note because this will eventually evolve into the Arab Socialist Ba'ath party. So don't worry about all these terminologies just of yet, but just know that this man is important. His name is Michel Aflaq. He also is quite the founder of this idea of Ba'athism and Arab nationalism, especially Pan-Arabism. Okay. Now he has a couple friends within the Syrian Parliament, also the Syrian military, notably a man by the name of Akran al-Hawaran, who helped Aflaq gain influence within the Syrian government with his ties to the military. Okay, that's the first man we're going to look at. We'll come back to this guy later. Okay. Another man we're going to look at is Salah al-Din al-Bitar. And again, as I say, I apologize for the pronunciation of these names. Arabic is not my first language. This man is a Sunni Arab. Okay, he is a co-founder in the the Ba'athist movement. He's sort of the co-founder of the Ba'ath movement in general. And I'll tell you a bit more about the Ba'ath movement when I get to talking about Pan-Arabism and Ba'athism in general. Now, both of these people are teachers of history, actually. And what they did is that they abandoned teaching history and started to organize a political movement, you could say, within Syria. They would hand out pamphlets, essentially, on their ideology, which I'll get to a bit later. Now, when it comes to this time, and I'll have to explain just a bit of it now, these individuals pushed something called Arabism, or sort of this idea of the Arab nation, that the Arab people are connected, have a rich history within the Middle East, and that expressions of their language and culture are important in order to maintain or to rid themselves essentially of the shackles of imperialism. A united Arab front must emerge to essentially expel not only the Europeans but also other colonial powers. This comes into the Ba'ath saying. I'll expand a bit on this a bit later. The Ba'ath saying of unity, freedom from occupation, and liberty. So keep that in mind. The third person that is important to the story is a man by the name of Zaki al-Arsuzi. Again, this guy, he's an atheist Alawite. You can see we have now a Christian Arab, a Sunni Arab, and an atheist Alawi, essentially. He is one of the important figures within Ba'athism as well, because like the other two, he's also a teacher of history, except unlike the other two, he actually establishes something called the Ba'ath, the Arab Ba'ath, in 1940, which is kind of a separate group, because you have, on the one hand, you have Michel Aflaq's Arab Iha movement on the one end, and you have, on the other hand, the Arab Ba'ath, which is his movement. Both of these parties have, in similarities, they have this idea of Arab nationalism at heart. This idea that the Arab people deserve a nation, and that they have to expel the occupiers of this nation. With al-Arsuzi, and I'll talk about him a bit more later, but with al-Arsuzi, he had this much more in-depth philosophy. So we call it like a meta-narrative in philosophy, like this grand narrative of history and the place of the Arabs within it. And he views the non-Arabs as being destructive to the Middle East, especially to the Arabs' identity. We'll come back to that later. Okay. He was teacher of history, and just looking at my notes. Yeah, cool. Now, this is the important flag to know about. This is the Arab Revolt flag. Now, it looks very, very different to the other flag I'll show after this directly. But it's important to understand about what this flag means, essentially, because we're going to be talking about now Pan-Arabism, Arab nationalism, and Ba'athism. So let's start off with Pan-Arabism. Pan-Arabism is the idea that there is an Arab nation, and that the people, Arab people, especially the people of the Middle East, who in this case is the Arabs, need to unite together and form a transnational entity known as a Pan-Arab state. Because it's only with this that they can, quote-unquote, reject reactionaryism, imperialism, and colonialism. Part of this concept central to Pan-Arabism is the idea of the superiority of the Arab identity, notably the superiority of the Arab people in the Middle East and their connected history and civilization. So there's the civilization, culture, history, and language that molds them together. Now, where Ba'athism is, and what Ba'athism is, it takes the concepts of Pan-Arabism, notably. It takes the principles of Pan-Arabism, notably the belief in an Arab nation, the unification of the Arab peoples, and unites it with the concept of Arab socialism. And in this case, Arab socialism, it means a kind of a united Arab people. It's not necessarily too much on progressive, you could say, beliefs in, say, for instance, pluralism of thought, and that, even though Michel Aflaq had some affiliation to that, it's more the case that it's for this idea of mending Arab nationalism to Arab socialism. So you actually have this national socialism that emerges from this ideology of Baathism. Now, Arab nationalism is essentially a much general form of Arabism, so this idea in the value of the Arab state. You could say that Pan-Arabism, if you want to sort of distinguish between Pan-Arabism, is a transnational ideology, sort of extends beyond the borders of just one nation to multiple nations, notably to the whole Middle East. This is why, for example, the Arab League was established in 1945. It was birthed out of this kind of this Pan-Arab ideology of making essentially one day a kind of like much united Arab peoples. Okay, even though, So Baathism is more localized, and we're going to go look into a bit more about that a bit later. Okay, so this is the flag of the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party. This is very important to note. So the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party emerges in 1947. It's a merger of the Arab Socialist movement as well as the older, how we can say, pronunciation again, the older Arab Ilha movement. Yeah. So we have to understand that in this time period, al-Arsuzi is becoming a bit disillusioned by the Arab movement, so he goes back to teaching. A lot of his followers go from the Ba'ath movement to the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, this newly established unified force in 1947. Now, prior to that, in 1946, after delaying, and might I just say that the French negotiated with the Arabs, especially the National Bloc and Hashem, I should say, negotiated with Hashem that there would be independence for the Arab states, for the Arab state of Syria, and it would be achieved by 1936. However, because the French did not want to be at that time countered by the Germans, they maintained their colonial possessions in Syria. So that's why, for example, Vichy France has control over Syria at this time. And when, of course, this all goes away and the Nazis are defeated, you have all these Arab socialists, so the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, amongst others, that sort of call for an independent Syria, which comes to fruition in 1945, where French troops are finally expelled from Syria in 1946. Now, you've got to understand at this time, a lot of Arab thinkers, especially at this time, especially al-Arsuzi, are inspired by National Socialist ideology, especially also Michel Aflaq. They take this idea of the value of the Arab identity, modeled on, you could say, Aryanism, not exactly, for example, verbatim on Aryanism, but value on the importance of the Arab identity to the state, and use that as a model, if you will, for what their project wants to be in the future. Okay. This brings us to a man by the name of General Abdel Nasser. I'm sure that all of you know who Gamal Abdel Nasser is. If you don't know who he is, you could say he was a commander in the Egyptian army. He helped overthrow King Farouk I of Egypt in 1952 through his Free Officers movement. This sort of arose this idea of a Arab state for the first time, this time being located in Egypt. Okay, and Gamal Abdel Nasser sort of popularized the concept of not just Egyptian nationalism but also Pan-Arabism. He called for the unification of the Arab peoples against this newly emergent state of Israel at that time. Because, as I noted earlier, the Balfour Declaration allowed for the existence of a Jewish state in, quote-unquote, what is called Palestine at the time. This would emerge later on after a war of independence from the Israelis into the State of Israel in 1948. All the Arab states were opposed to this quote-unquote Zionist project, as they called it, and united against one another to try to fight the Israelis in 1948. And unfortunately, they lost. Well, you could say fortunately, I should say they lost. Yeah. Now, during this time as well, more Arab Baathists are elected to power in 1954. Yeah. And in 1958, there's also a Pan-Arab movement that overthrows King Faisal, led by Qasem. forgot his first name, Qasem, General Qasem, in Iraq, and establishes to power the Ba'ath movement over there, because the Ba'ath movement thought that Qasem would be an extension of the Arab movement. He kind of turned out not to be. He turned out to be more of an Iraqi nationalist than anything else. We'll get to that soon enough. In 1958, there also emerged a United Arab Republic. Now, what is the United Arab Republic? You could say it was a brief experiment between Pan-Arab states, notably Egypt and Syria, who went into union of creating this united Arab state, sort of to embrace Pan-Arabism. Now, the whole idea that this would be sort of the blueprint and that states like Iraq would join, hence is why a large disappointment of the Ba'ath movement in Syria was the disappointment of Qasem not joining with the rest of the Arab states. So the current Syrian flag you see today is sort of modeled off of this brief project of the UAR. Because the whole aim was that the UAR would be a model for the rest of the Middle East on how a united Arab state can emerge. However, this never came to fruition, unfortunately, at least to some. From 1958 to 1961, most of the power was concentrated in Egypt. Okay, a lot of the concentration of power, especially military power, was in Egypt. This disappointed and angered a lot of Syrians within Syria, who thought that this would be a fair deal, who thought that this would be a fair arrangement between the Syrians and the Egyptians. That did not come to fruition. This brings us to 1961, where 1961, where a coup d'etat takes place in Syria and breaks the union of Syria and Egypt. The military come and take control of Syria and establish, if you will, a little puppet government under the People's Party. And that's where you could have like the modern Free Syria flag you see. It comes from by the way, the modern Free Syria flag that you see today comes actually from the 1930s, when under the French mandate there was this quasi-independence from 1936 to 1946. And then from 1946 onward, it maintained the Free Syria flag until, of course, 1958. And then from 1961, it reimposed the Free Syria flag. However, in 1962, during this time, and this is like an important detour for now, because we have to mention the persecution of different minorities in the country. So this brings us to the institutionalization, the slow institutionalization of Arab nationalism. At this time, the popularity of Pan-Arabism had extended throughout the Middle East, and Arab states found it in their best interest to institutionalize their ideologies. In the case of Syria, the institutionalization of Arab nationalism and the policies employed to try homogenize non-Arab identities became a sort of a central player. So in the areas of Hasakah, for example, there was a consensus in 1962 done by the Minister of Interior for Hasakah, which stripped thousands of Kurds of their citizenship and classed them as foreigners, okay, or makmun. This was done in order to repossess areas controlled by Kurds and to erase what they called a potential separatist movement in the northeast. This is like the first example of what we call Arabization, the policy of implementing this statewide and state-sponsored policy of ensuring that no minorities exist within the state and that the only citizen that there is the Syrian Arab. There's not the Syrian Kurd, not the Syrian Druze, none of that. It's only the Syrian Arab. That's what the kind of Ba'athist mentality and also the Pan-Arab mentality and also the Arab nationalist mentality enforced. There's this idea that the Arab people are special, that the Arab people have a role in the Middle East, and that the Middle East belongs to Arab people, and non-Arabs need to get out the way or submit to this. That's the idea of it. Yeah. This culminates in another coup, because Syria is noted for coups. In 1954 there was a coup, and now in 1961 there's a coup, and now there's another coup in 1963. This time it leads to the establishment of Aflaq and the Arab Socialist Ba'ath party into power. This is known as, they call it the March 8th Revolution. And we sort of like, it's a thin veil for a military coup, essentially, which is at that time led by Said, or maybe by Said necessarily. No, not Said, sorry, wrong person. Yeah. During this time as well, unfortunately, Qasem is killed in the Ramadan Revolution by the Ba'ath Party, who takes power over there. So you could say this, or you'd say that there's different groups that operate in Iraq and Syria. At this time, the Ba'ath Party is like this one entity. It's not split off yet. There had been sort of disagreements between Aflaq and other Ba'athists, but there was not any widespread schism just yet. However, this all changes after 1963. So in 1963, following the coup that establishes the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party and Aflaq's leadership, another coup comes to fruition and is led by Jadid and Hafez, who oust Michel Aflaq and oust Aflaqites, as they're called, which are sort of supporters of Aflaq, from power, establishing Jadids, sort of like Jadid, and establishing Jadid and Hafez al-Assad in power. Now, at the time, Hafez al-Assad is not the central figure at this point. He's sort of establishing control silently behind the doors of power. He's establishing family networks, whereas Jadid, who is part of what we call the neo-Ba'athists at this time. These neo-Ba'athists wanted to break away from the old guard, notably Michel Aflaq and all of his supporters, and wanted to sort of establish a new direction. Because at this time, there's this idea that there's a military Ba'ath and then there's a Ba'ath party. And they wanted to make the military Ba'ath party the only Ba'ath party. Yeah, because Aflaq actually wanted to continue to support the UAR, and the military thought this as like a failure. And hence, part of the reason why they even couped Aflaq was this idea that he wanted to rejoin with the Nasser's forces and rejoin with Egypt in this union again. So that happened in 1968. Now in 1970, Hafez al-Assad consolidates power. Prior to that, even after the coup of 1968, Hafez al-Assad had been consolidating power behind closed doors. He had been establishing his confidants in centers of power throughout the military, and he was placing himself in a position to take power. And that is what he did in 1970, where disagreements between Jadid and Assad led to this idea of a corrective movement. And this, of course, is a thin veil for another coup within Syria, which Hafez al-Assad, Air Force commander, and an Alawite from places like Latakia led. And they ousted Jadid and ousted Aflaqites, the remaining Aflaqites, and established a kind of a new direction for the Ba'ath Party. And surprisingly led under the old man, and this is sort of like, I'll go back to person I mentioned initially, and in a second. Yeah, there we go. Oh, sorry. There we go. Sorry about that. Arsuzi. Again, pardon me for the pronunciation. They led under, the Ba'ath Party became more structured under his ideology, which is much more, it was less, you could say, radical. It's less progressive, quote unquote, than Aflaq's ideology. But the Ba'ath Party thought it best to make this figure over here the main figure of the Syrian Ba'ath Party, because at this point the Syrian Ba'ath Party split with the Iraqi Ba'ath Party. The Iraqi Ba'ath Party welcomed Michel Aflaq into the wings of the Ba'ath Party. They welcomed his ideology, they welcomed his specific view of Arab nationalism. In fact, Michel Aflaq was praised under Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and he was actually honored as one of the most central important figures for the Iraqi Ba'ath movement. In contrast, Hafez al-Assad denounced Hafez al-Assad denounced Michel Aflaq and established Arsuzi as the main founder of Ba'athism. So, yeah, okay. Now, part of what the many changes that Hafez al-Assad did within the government is he established his own people and his own family into positions of power within the government. The Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party became the main party of the state, and the ideology of the Ba'ath Party became taught within schools with the slogans of unity, freedom, and liberty. Now, the Ba'ath Party anthem became the anthem of the party that would be recited from all the people who are adherents to the ideology. Hafez al-Assad established his people within power, but also he established the Alawite class as the dominant class within Syria. So you would have the Alawites, who historically had the Alawite state, as I mentioned before. He would have his commanders and his family members who were notable Alawites. He would put them in positions of power, whereas conscripts usually would be Sunnis and those other loyalists essentially to Hafez al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad would change this later. Part of the many reforms, you could say many, I don't want to use the term reform because that kind of implies a positive change. It's not really that way. It's more of a negative reforms, if you want to put it, to Syria. Hafez al-Assad starts to institutionalize the Arab nationalist ideology into the fabric of Syria, of what it means to be Syrian. So here is an example. In 1973, a new constitution is established within Syria. Now, as you can see, these are the first 10 articles of the Syrian constitution. Now, if you've noticed in Article 1 of Article 1 subsection 2, sorry, Article 1.2 and 3, you'll notice that the Syrian Arab region is a part of the Arab homeland. The people in the Syrian Arab region are a part of the Arab nation. They work and struggle to achieve the Arab nation's comprehensive unity. Before that, it establishes that the Syrian Arab Republic is a democratic, popular, socialist, and sovereign state. No part of its territory can be seceded. Syria is a member of the Union of the Arab Republics. This idea of, again, this pan-Arab ideology that you see within the constitution, but also you see this idea of Arab being associated with Syrian. So to be a Syrian citizen is to be a Syrian Arab. Now this would be later amended in 2012, but not much, not in a sort of a heavy way. It still maintains that the Arab identity is central to the Syrian state. And this is sort of an example. You can also see that the leading party in the society in the state is the Socialist Arab Ba'ath Party. It leads a progressive front seeking to unite the resources of the people's masses and place them at the service of the Arab nation's goals. So there we go, the Arab socialism part, so it's like socialism with Arab characteristics, and Syrian nationalism or Arab nationalism. So you have this national socialism. Okay. Some very important to note, because in 1973, you also have this cult of personality start to be created around the Assad regime. Because what Assad does differently than what Saddam Hussein did necessarily in Iraq is he made the party serve his family. So not only do you have the Arab Ba'ath ideology in power, but you also have it in service of Hafez al-Assad and in service of the Assad family. They are the central family in the society. Now, if we fast forward a little bit, because now we're going to be moving more onto recent context, and we're going to be moving more onto the Syrian conflict, and we're going to be moving more onto the consequences of this ideology. Now, since Hafez al-Assad has been in power at the time from 1971 all the way to 2000, where in 2000, Hafez al-Assad dies of a brain tumor and is replaced by his younger son, Bashar al-Assad. Now, Bashar al-Assad was never going to be the original pick. The original pick was going to be Bassel al-Assad. Bassel al-Assad was a military commander in the Syrian army who was killed in 1994, due to a car crash. He crashed while on the route to Damascus International Airport. So, the docile son, Bashar al-Assad, gets recalled from England, and he comes along with his wife and starts to be trained, if you will, under the Assad family doctrine. He becomes trained to be leader of the country. Now, people think that people think that Bashar al-Assad, when he came to power in 2000, people thought that he would actually reform the country, because only had there been a couple past attempts at retaking power, one by Rafat al-Assad, who tried to take power from Hafiz al-Assad when he was in a coma in the early 1980s, which failed, and also from this growing democratic movement that was existing within Syria at the time. So what you have now is that you have Bashar al-Assad as this young face that people believe is going to bring reform to the country. He's going to change the country. He's going to make life better for Sunnis. He's going to make it better for other populations within the country. That's something called the Damascus Spring. However, those assurances soon fail when Bashar al-Assad starts cracking down on enemies to his father. He actually cracks down more so than his father did. He consolidates his control in not only his own family, but also in the most loyal of individuals within the military to him. So now Hafiz al-Assad used to arrange it to have like certain military families that would be in control of different areas. Bashar al-Assad changed that. He made it completely a loyalist club, essentially. So that's why, for example, Bashar al-Assad would appoint members of his family who may not have been qualified in being an Air Force commander or a tank commander. He appoints them to make important decisions. Bashar al-Assad's one of, I think, 4 or 5 siblings. Maher al-Assad, as well as others as well. So there's Bassel al-Assad. That's why sometimes you'll see, especially in other parts of Syria, I don't know if they still have these posters around like that, you'll still see old posters of Bassel al-Assad with Hafiz al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad. This brings us to 2004. In 2004, there's something called the Qamishli riots, where during a football game, there is kind of this tension between people from Qamishli, who are supporting the Kurdish team there, and the people who are supporting the Arab team from Deir Zor. This actually leads to some of the Arab supporters raising portraits of Saddam Hussein. And for those of you who don't know the importance, or so you could say the relevance of this, is that Saddam Hussein gassed the Kurds in late 1980s during the al-Anfal campaign. He killed thousands of Kurds through mustard gas and sarin gas. So Saddam Hussein has always been viewed as a tyrannical figure for Kurds, and kind of like the sort of the epitome of the consequences of Baathism in terms on non-Kurds. So in 2004, there's the Qamishli riots, where Kurds start to throw stones at Arabs, and there's a lot of fist fights, and this sort of leads to the desecration of a Hafiz al-Assad statue later on, which leads to the army being called in to crack down on these people. This brings us, fast forward a little bit more, to 2011. So in 2011, for those of you who just don't know much about what happened or why the Syrian civil war happened to begin with, I have a video, I believe, on that I want to make a bit later, but I'll just mention in brief. Essentially, the Arab Spring sweeps the Middle East. Ideas of democracy start to become popular, and Syrians decide to protest against the government. Now, part of this event came from children who started to write sort of slogans against Bashar on schools, and that they were kidnapped by the Muqarrabat, who were the secret intelligence forces of the Assad regime. They're kidnapped and they're actually brutalized, and their bodies are sort of filmed in disgusting states. This sort of pushes for more protests, essentially, because people are reacting to these images. This all culminates to Bashar al-Assad sending troops out to try and quell the rioters. This fails, and this leads to a civil war, a full-blown civil war, which we're dealing with today. Now, during the civil war, people thought that Bashar al-Assad would be out of power in 2012-2013, because at that time, huge defections from the army, especially from the Sunni quarter of the army, meant that you had different people joining the Syrian opposition, or the Free Syrian Army at that time, and the newly formed Syrian National Coalition of political exiles who wanted to form a kind of a counter-government to the Bashar al-Assad government. And Bashar al-Assad calls upon the help of not only Hezbollah, but also Iran, which help him with munitions and armaments. Towards this time period, you have the infiltration of transnational jihadist groups such as Jabhat al-Nusra and later on Daesh, which become a huge problem in Syria. This actually prompts, in 2014-2015, late 2015, prompts Russia to get involved in late 2015 to help secure Bashar al-Assad's reign. And the situation has been since then. Daesh is on the backslide, but there still remains various pockets owned by the opposition, as well as the more Kurdish fights in the northeast of the People's Protection Units, the YPG. I've done a full video on the Kurds of Syria, that's why I'm not going too much into detail. If you want more detail on that, I'll link it in the description box below. Now, during this time period, you have now Bashar al-Assad being backed by Nasrallah in Lebanon with Hezbollah. You have him backed by Khamenei in Iran with the IRGC. And then, of course, you have being backed by the Putin regime in Russia. This leads us to where we are today, which is essentially on a state of war. The country is completely fractured. There is various different opposition groups, some transnational jihadist groups, others simply groups in the northeast, such as the Kurdish groups of the People's Protection Units, being backed by the United States, and you have transnational actors such as Hatar al-Sham, or the sort of rebranded version of Jabhat al-Nusra, being backed by backed somewhat by Turkey, and you have sort of the Syrian National Army being backed by Turkey as well, and you have, of course, the Syrian government, or the Bashar al-Assad regime, being backed by Russia and Iran. Now, Bashar al-Assad has maintained that every inch of Syria must come under the control of the Assad government. Now, for those of you who are curious about that salute, people say it's the Roman salute, but here's the thing about it, is that a part of the Muqarabat's training back in the 1940s and 1950s is that they got the help of ex-Nazis. I just want to quickly bring up a quick essay that I did write. I just have a note there that I just remember the person's name. Hold on a second. Okay, cool. So they acquired the help from people like the harbour Nazi war criminals such as Alois Brunner, who helped assist the training of the Muqarabat, so the Syrian intelligence forces, to kind of be modelled off of the Gestapo. And a lot of the Ba'athist ideology is also anti-Zionist as well. So there's also a reason why you'll see that salute all the time. It's not just because it's a Roman salute. It's because it's been indoctrinated from a young age for a good chunk of Syrians. Some being, of course, susceptible to this influence, others not. But a lot of Syrians, for example, have been taught this salute. And people will say, oh, it's not Nazi salute, it's just occasional normal Roman salute. But the way it's utilized, especially by individuals such as the Syrian Socialist National Party, which are SSNP, it's more than just a salute. It's actually a profession of this Arab national socialism. Now it brings us to now with kind of current situation at the moment. So in the northeast of the country, there are, as I said before, I remember telling you all that there's a bunch of different ethnicities within Syria. It's a multi-ethnic state. It's not just a homogenous Arab state. It's not like just a purely Sunni Arab state. It's a state with Druze, Circassians, Syriacs, and so on. A large portion of these people happen to be Kurds. There's about over 1 million Kurds in the northeast of Syria, who, along with many revolutionaries in the early days, I was reading the comment section, kind of distracted me a bit, who in the northeast decided to fight for something called the Rojava Project. This Rojava Project is this idea of trying to break the Syrian Ba'athist Arab nationalist ideology that's systemic in the Syrian state, and to try to replace it with this kind of more decentralized, multi-ethnic ideology. At least that's the idea of the Rojava project. It had backing from various different organizations, such as the PYD, or the Democratic Union Party, which is the chief party within the northeast. I have a whole video on the Kurds, so I won't go extremely into detail. What you just have to know is that the Rojava project, under the government of the Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria, is trying to provide an alternative model to the Syrian model, because this brings us into the question of what should be done about Arab nationalism in Syria. I've mentioned throughout this whole podcast, I've mentioned the history, brief overview of the Ottoman Empire, brief overview of the Ottoman Empire's influence in Syria, the Syrian Arab Revolt, the influence of Baathism in Syria, the multiple coups, as well as the institutionalization of Arab nationalism. This has affected the entire generation of Syrians and affected the sort of the mindset of what the Syrian state should be. Many people, unfortunately, I think, aren't really talking about a Syrian Democratic Republic, like in terms of a multi-ethnic Syrian Democratic Republic, not just a Syrian Arab Republic, but a Syrian Democratic Republic. We have different ethnicities from across the board being recognized in the constitution. Because in 2012, Assad, through some concessions, he did alter the constitution slightly to acknowledge the different groups within Syria, but he didn't say, for example, he didn't get rid of the whole notion that Arab identity is tied to Syrianness. What does that mean, in other words, is that there's still this connection between, the Arab identity. To be a Syrian, you have to be an Arab, essentially, which is not always the case, and it's not reflective, essentially, of what Syria is. It's a multi-ethnic country. So in the northeast, they're trying this thing called the Rojava project. It's being backed at the moment by the Democratic Union Party, who is a part of a coalition called the Movement for Democratic Society. These individuals and parties are trying to work along with their militias, notably the People's Protection Units and the wider militias, the multi-ethnic militias of the Syrian Democratic Forces, to try and actually bring about some form of alternative model to the Syrian Ba'ath ideology. The Syrian Baathists, of course, don't want this. They don't want a change in the ideology, because at the end of the day, Bashar al-Assad is the supreme leader, and the Ba'ath ideology is the supreme ideology of the state. And that is the mentality. So even now, the Rojava administration, I would call it, is trying its best to negotiate something with the Ba'ath government. But the Ba'ath government is quite fanatical in their determination to assert that every inch of Syria shall become under the part of the government. And I think that's a mistake, because it's the mistake that, for example, Saddam Hussein made after the first Gulf War. What did he do after the first Gulf War, you ask? He moved towards making the state much more centralized under his control, even more so than previously. He made a union with the more Salafist wings during what is called the Faith Campaign, to try unite the Salafists and the Baathists together. Hence is why, for example, and not to go too much on a tangent, why, for example, Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Daesh members, the higher echelons, were always former Ba'ath officials, because they're training in that field. So here with Rojava, they're trying to present an alternative project. Now, as I mentioned, these are just like an example. So here's a picture of the Druze. The Druze themselves have a significant population in the south of the country near the Golan Heights, as well as in the Golan Heights. Because you have to remember that in 1973 there was the Yom Kippur War, where Israel essentially annexed the Golan Heights from Syria. And part of the Golan Heights, and also part of the south as well, have influence of Druze there as well. There's also Circassians, for example. There's Syriacs. The Syriacs, for example, have actually regained their culture and their religion, because they can express it more openly now in the northeast, because prior to that they had been discriminated against by the Ba'ath administration. Because the Ba'ath administration, part of its ideology is not just Ba'athism but also Islamism. The idea essentially, not now you may say, oh, well, it's not like the transnational jihadists or that kind of stuff. No, of course not. It's more the case that the main law is Islamic jurisprudence, and for that, the state of the religion of Syria is Islam. That's the religion of the state. Yes, it says they may respect other religions, but that's more on paper, more theory based. It's not actually implemented that way. Because, there's one vision of what we want society to look like on paper, and there's another of what it actually looks like on the ground. And that has to be recognized for anyone who's looking at Syria. It's just looking at, for example, how many different ethnic groups and different religious groups are actually denied their religious autonomy under the Syrian government. Okay. And of course we have the Kurds over here, who are one fragment of a bigger whole. That is Syria in general. Now, you're going to get some Kurdish nationalists, and you're going to get some people who want greater Kurdish autonomy. But from my understanding of the Rojava in general, and the Rojava project, as well as people in the northeast, they simply want civil rights. They simply want their rights to be acknowledged by the government. They simply want to be able to actually exist within a Syria that actually accepts them. They don't want to be beholden to this Ba'athist education that tells them, okay, Arab supremacy, sorry, you could say the Arab identity is the supreme identity, and that non-Arabs are not Syrian. I think they don't want that. At the end of the day, they want essentially rights, and they want to be recognized. Okay? Now, this is a picture of what the Autonomous Administration Northeast Syria's emblem looks like. This is from the North Press Agency. And you can see that, I wish I should have got a better picture. But part of the emblem, you have Syriac, you have essentially Aramaic, Turkish, Arabic, Kurdish, all in one emblem, and this idea that Syria should be a multi-ethnic republic. However, you always are going to have those individuals such as such as the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party over here. By the way, if you don't know what the SSNP, I'll actually do a video on Lebanon as well when I get to it. But to give you sort of like a brief overview of the SSNP, they were founded by Antoine Sadat, and they have this idea in 1932 on this idea of a greater Syria. Yes, you're right that you may say, well, that looks kind of like a Nazi, swastika. It's based on that. It's actually what we call a hurricane emblem. It's meant to look nearly like a Nazi swastika, because that's what it's based off of. That's the inspiration for the ideology. Is you have these individuals who are much more, believe it or not, much more nationalistic than the Syrian Ba'ath Party. So just keep that in mind. If you think Bashar al-Assad and Hafiz al-Assad were extreme when it comes to their nationalism, these people take the cake, essentially. So I just want to give a statistic, actually, of how many people have died so far in the war. So according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, it documents that nearly 600,000 people have died throughout the course of the conflict. The bulk of deaths being attributed to the Assad regime's bombing campaigns, especially its attacks on civilian centers, such as hospitals and schools. And also the other figure that contributes as well is, of course, transnational jihadism within Syria, which has taken root and stem in there. So you have a situation now in Syria where you have a country that is deeply fragmented, with a government that is deeply fanatical, that refuses to acquiesce to any form of concessions in terms of altering the dominant ideology. And this is a bit of a concern, because the only way that Syria can actually heal, or somewhat heal, from its current predicament is through the change of the ideology that gave rise to this extremism. And that has to do with the ideology of the Ba'ath Party and the ideology of Assad, with Assadism. This is the reason why the war has occurred to begin with, is because Assad refused to acquiesce to protests and refused to allow for a transition in his government to some form of democracy. And this is also influenced on the opposition as well, because of the decades, if you will, of Ba'athist education system. You still have this kind of this deep-seated bigotry towards Kurds and other groups in the northeast who are not even consulted about a future Syria. So it goes back to the question now of what should be done about Arab nationalism in Syria. The only way that this is going to be solved, at least from my perspective of what I've learned, is that fundamentally you have to get rid of the ideology of Baathism. That's non-negotiable. That ideology needs to be erased. You also should get rid of this Arab supremacist-esque type ideology as well that comes with Baathism. This idea that Syria must remain a Syrian Arab Republic. Now, I think that the Kurds, for example, in the northeast, in the Rojava especially, they tried in 2015, for example, via Russia, through a Moscow delegation to Damascus. They tried to put the proposal of changing the name of Syrian Arab Republic to the Syrian Democratic Republic, which seems like a very minor change. But the Assad regime refused even that minor change, because to them, Syria is an Arab state. It's not a multi-ethnic state, it's an Arab state. That's fundamentally that needs to change, that mentality. I also support, for example, the UN Resolution 2254, which is the main resolution put forward by the United Nations Security Council, which pushes for, essentially, the political settlement of the Syrian conflict. However, I only support it, and I'll only support it if it can actually acknowledge 25% of the rest of the country, which is in the northeast. Because fundamentally, you cannot have political settlement when you have literally a quarter of your country not even being acknowledged or even be recognized. So that needs to change. Now, with all that said, I mean, I can now open it up to for questions, essentially. Thank you all for listening. I'll now answer some questions, essentially. Yeah. So let's see what questions we have. Okay. Anthony, why do you think... Okay, so Jaeger asks, Anthony, why do you think there are some left-wing Western reporters that support as Assad Ba'athist government rather than democratic Syrian government? Well, there's plenty of reasons for that. I mean, I could assume that there's connections to the Ba'ath government themselves. If you want to be less conspiratorial in that sense, it's just because they believe that the Syrian Ba'ath government has not done anything wrong, and that this whole insurrection that has come around is just that, an insurrection posed by terrorists, quote-unquote. Because this is the mentality of what the government views as the opposition. They view the opposition as terrorists. And in some respect, that has become a sad kind of reality in the sense that you have a large segment of the opposition that are jihadists. But that's only because of the Assad regime's bombing initiatives against those people. You've radicalized an entire generation of people over a decade who say to themselves, why should they submit to Bashar al-Assad? I mean, when these people basically are providing an alternative to his system of government that they will support. I don't support the transnational terrorists, of course. I only support the transnational jihadists. I don't believe their visions actually of a kind of a Syrian Arab Islamic emirate is a viable option for all of Syria, because that, first of all, it gets rid of non-Muslim communities, but also doesn't really change the Arab supremacism that's embedded in the state. Fundamentally, I think that a democratic republic, one that is at least a federation of some sort, because I think that if you acknowledge all the different communities, I mean, despite me having disagreements with the French mandate, this idea of having like an Alawite federal state or a Druze federal state or a Kurdish federal state with Rojava and so on and so forth, I think those are good ideas within the framework of Syria. I think by pushing for democratic elections, at least pushing for a transitionary government with democratic elections, and pushing for the security of rights of minorities, because at the end of the day, you have to remember that the Alawites under Bashar al-Assad believe that their very survival is at stake. And that's why they actually support the Bashar al-Assad government, because they believe that their survival is tied exactly with the Bashar al-Assad regime. Because the Bashar al-Assad regime has said, hey, look, those people want to kill you. with that in mind, any constitution that's formed, I think, needs to acknowledge the rights of the minorities and actually has to somehow enforce that. And I know that in Rojava, for example, you have the Syrian Democratic Forces who secure that area. I think that, if anything, acknowledging their service and allowing them to govern their own areas under this new Syrian Democratic Republic wouldn't be a bad idea, actually. That's just my thing. I do have a bias, of course, but I'll admit that openly. So, okay, Conspiracy BS asks, how do you think Biden will handle the conflict, and how much longer do you see the conflict lasting? I wish I could say that I think Biden will somehow magically intervene to end it, but my more cynical side says probably not. What I do think the Biden administration will do is maintain current operations in support of the Syrian Democratic Forces in countering the long endurance of the defeat of Daesh, in other words. Because the only reason why the United States actually went into Syria, besides funding some groups essentially of the opposition, which had kind of cancelled that policy, may I just say, in 2017. The reason why it's now there today is to fight Daesh, to get rid of Daesh and eliminate Daesh. I wish it would transition the support from defeating Daesh with the local partner force of the Syrian Democratic Forces to an actual policy of recognizing the autonomy of somewhat, or recognizing essentially the political autonomy of Rojava as one of them, of one of the sort of the federal states within a united Syria. Because I believe that the only way you can actually get anywhere when it comes to Syria, you have to have the numbers and force behind you. That's why, the Assad regime has kind of survived. It's because they have the backing of Russia and Iran, who are big states. How long do I think the conflict will last? At the moment, the big offensives that I see on the horizon, I think Idlib will be the next big offensive. Although people have told me that Russia and Turkey are arranging sort of a final state for Idlib. In that sense, they are arranging more demilitarized zones and sort of enforcing the demarcation lines that they've agreed with one another. Where do I think that will go? I think ultimately at the end of the day, Russia will try their best to get parts of Idlib to the Assad regime, because the Assad regime is very fanatical. It lives in a bubble, very bubble that it thinks that it's actually not wrong in the wrong. I also think, for example, that in the northeast, there's pressure by Turkey to annex the remaining parts of Rojava, or the Autonomous Administration Northeast Syria, because it's already used two operations, Operation Olive Branch and Operation Peace Spring, one, the former dealing with the annexation of Afrin, while the latter dealing with the annexation of Serikania and Girespi, northeast. I think that those two areas, I don't know if it will continue that. I'm hoping the Biden administration can keep a block to that. So if you're asking how long do I think the war's going to go on for, I think it's going to go on for at least the next 2 to 3 years, the minimum. It's at the moment it's going to slow frozen conflict at the moment. However, at any point it can kind of erupt, and that's the worry. Okay. Sean says, who among the pro-regime fighters would you describe as Arab nationalists? What is their relationship with the Shia jihadists and foreign mercenaries fighting for the regime? Who among the pro-regime fighters would you describe as Arab nationalists? I would say that definitely the NDF, or the National Defense Forces, the voluntary Assad forces, are very nationalist in terms of their outlook, like their Arab nationalist outlook. I also believe that the SSMP fighters are also quite Arab nationalists. There are some segments of the SAA that are also Arab nationalist. However, you got to remember that the SAA consists of those conscripts of a variety of different ethnic groups, some of which will not be as Arab nationalist as, say, for instance, the Tiger Forces, or, the SSMP, or the volunteer groups who actually volunteer to fight for the Assad regime. What's their relationship with the Shia jihadists and foreign mercenaries fighting for the regime? Now, the Shia jihadists, if you want to call, I assume that you're talking about the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps and the groups that they back, specifically with Hezbollah and other paramilitaries within Syria. If you're talking about them, I think that that's a completely different dynamic. But, for example, the Iranian regime is not as Arab nationalist, quote unquote, because they aren't Arab nationalists at all. They're more as we could say, they're more Khomeiniist. They have their ideology that they want to implement in the Middle East. They want to counter Zionism. So in that sense, you could say that there's more a relationship built on mutual defense for Assad, as well as anti-Zionism in general. Because there's a lot of fighters within, especially the senior ranks, that still believe that Israel is a big threat to the Middle East. Now, the foreign mercenaries, I would assume you're talking about Wagner Corps, and those other mercenaries that have been employed by the actual, government itself. Those Wagner Corps, the Wagner fighters are doing it simply for money, I think, at the end of the day. It's like a job for them. Give them money, they'll do their job, essentially. Okay, Richard Rosette asks, how have you read any good books about Syria? If so, would you recommend any? Oh yes, that's the other thing I need to. Thank you for reminding me. I was going to actually got the list here. Okay, so that's fucking books there. Sorry about the language. A great book that I recommend is by a man by the name of David W. Lesh. It's called Syria. It's a great introduction to Syria. It's a small book. It's a very small book. It's only got roughly 200 pages of, at least this is the size of A5. It's a very small book. Very worthwhile. So Syria by David W. Lesh. He's a historian. Next one is by Harriet Alsop and Vladimir van Wilgenberg. It's called The Kurds in Northern Syria. If you want a detailed history of the Kurds, I definitely recommend this book by them. It's called The Kurds of Northern Syria, Governance, Diversity, and Conflicts. If you want other stuff on the Kurds in general, I would recommend stuff from David McDowell. The History of the Kurds is a great book. That's a very well sourced and very referenced book. Michael Gunter has also some good books as well. Yes, that's what I mean, small pages. I'm not joking, it's like an A5 book. It's very small. I was amazed at just how small it is. Actually, it took me a couple of hours to read it though. Another book that I recommend is I have another book on Syria, and I'm trying to find where it is. The Raqqa Diaries is a pretty good book as well. That gives you sort of an insight into how people lived in, during the occupation of Raqqa by Jabhat al-Nusra and Daesh. So, yep. There's other books that I'll definitely recommend in the comment section. Sorry, not the comment section. The description below. So don't worry. I'll definitely reference all the stuff that I mentioned, because there's plenty of journals as well that I need to reference after I've done this podcast. Okay, so can you put the book list in? Yeah, I'm going to do that, Mr. Mass Creation Broadcast. I'm going to put everything I source, because if you look at my other streams that I've done, I've always put links to the books and links to the articles that I've used within the description box. Because at the end of the day, I want people to do their own research. I don't want you to just blindly trust me in that. The only reason why I know the stuff I do is because I've read quite a good deal on this, and I've actually talked with people from the region. I've actually been to the region as well. And I must say that I'm also studying the region as well. So, at the moment I'm doing a double degree with the major in politics and international relations and the Bachelor of Laws. So I also write for a number of different outlets, such as the Jerusalem Post, Aria Magazine, and the region. So my area has always been focused on specifically the Middle East and mostly minority rights. That's why I know a great deal about the Kurds. And I wanted to also touch upon this topic because I think it's a very important topic that's understated. Because I think that Arab nationalism is still intrinsic in the state, and that we need to not ignore it, because at the end of the day, if you want to deal with Baathism in general, if you want to deal with trying to unroot this ideology, you have to understand where it came from, why it is in power at the moment, and how one can actually provide alternative models to it. Hello, Mr. Aguirre Xavier. Pardon me with my pronunciation of the Kurdish name and that. Okay, it's good that you, I guess, support the YPG. I tend to support the People's Protection Unions because I find it one of the better groups in the Syrian conflict. I always try to say to people, don't necessarily blindly support any militia. Just support the models that some of these militias will protect. So, for instance, I support the Rojava model because I believe it's a good alternative for the rest of Syria, because it actually combines elements of decentralization. Because you have to remember that Syria is a unitary state. So I do think that you need to have some form of delineation, demolition. I forgot the actual term for it. Decentralization of the state, where there's no power concentrated in Damascus alone. And I also think that there needs to be acknowledgement of ethnic rights as well. So let me see what else. Is there any other questions? Let's see. If you've got any other questions, please please ask now. Or how Jeb Bush would say, please clap. Yeah. So I mean, this has been a little fun stream I wanted to do, because I'm always passionate about this area of the world, because I do think that more people need to learn more about this region. It's a very understudied region. There's plenty of experts who are local from the region. I recommend always, whether they be Kurdish or Arab and that. Just make sure you read a great deal around this issue as well, because when it comes to Syria itself, you're going to have a lot of misinformation here and there that you've got to be careful of, because the war is still ongoing. There's still efforts by multiple sides to try and muddy the water for Syria. But I'm hoping that, with all this said, I'm hoping that all of you now would have gotten a better idea of at least how Arab nationalism came to be in Syria, why it's there, and what potential avenues one can go in to try and resolve or try and deal with this issue. And yeah, so thank you all for watching. If you want to follow me at Stoic Viper on Twitter. You can also I've got new questions. Do you think Turkey is the bigger threat to okay. Do you think Turkey or the Assad regime is the big threat to the SDF in the long term? Well, that's a complicated question. At the moment, the Kurds' immediate threat is from both, but I believe that Turkey's becoming more dictatorial, more autocratic in nature as time goes on, especially under Erdogan, which is a problem. And I need to do a Turkey video as well. Thank you for reminding me. I have done a Turkey video already. That's the last video I did. That's a good question. But I do think that the Assad regime still is the immediate threat. Well, I do think that in terms of harmfulness, I mean, they're both harmful. That's the thing about it, is that this is actually kind of a hard question for me. Do you think Turkey or the Assad regime is the bigger threat to this SDF in the long term? Because the thing about it, in the long term, Turkey poses a threat, for example, to the existence of Rojava in general and the SDF. But the Assad regime has always posed a threat with its racism towards Kurds and minorities in general. So if you had to tell me which is the long term or the bigger threat of the two, I would say that Turkey is the bigger threat in the long run. It's always been the main threat for Kurds in the region. I do think it's the long-term threat because, unfortunately, there's no action being done to curtail Erdogan's power at the moment. The Assad regime is only in existence because of Russia and Iran. And if Russia and Iran want it to capture the NES, then it will. So I honestly think that, long-term speaking, Turkey is the bigger threat. But I'm not ignoring the Assad regime in the immediacy. And people may think, it's absurd you say that the Assad regime is not the biggest threat. I mean, think about it this way. The Assad regime is only surviving because of Iran and Turkey. That's the only reason... Sorry, Iran and Russia. That's the only reason why they are surviving at the moment. Without those two, the Assad regime would be nothing. Turkey at the moment has its own military, its own force, its own ideology, and doesn't need Russia or Iran to move. It moves on its own accord. That's the thing, and it's not getting any better. It's actually getting worse over time. So technically it is the bigger threat in the long term. In the immediate term, you could say the Assad regime, I guess. Okay. Jaeger is asking questions. By the way, please ask more questions. I mean, I don't mind answering questions. So Jaeger, what other countries are involved in Syrian civil war? Russia, Chechen, Wagner, Armenia, Syrian, Turkish, Iraq, Iran, US, UK. Okay, so from my knowledge, you have Russia and Iran being the main guarantors of Syria. You have Turkey being the main guarantor of the SNA, or the opposition. You have funding from Qatar and Saudi Arabia, certain individuals within those two countries, mostly Qatar when it comes to Hatar al-Sham and previously Jaish al-Islam. You have the United States, the United Kingdom. You also have France, by the way. France is also involved in the northeast. I know, funny enough, the French still have somehow managed to keep a foot in Syria all these years' time. Although, of course, to be fair on them, they're no longer, the Third Republic kind of era anymore. Okay, so Agera says, I think Turkey is not good because I'm Kurdish and I live in Kurdistan of Turkey and you killed a lot of Kurdish peoples in my city. Yeah, you're right, Agera. I mean, Turkey has been waging a war against the PKK for a long time in Turkey, but that war comes out of its larger war against Kurdish autonomy. And we have to remember that Turkey has essentially put the southeast in this kind of quasi-security state. We have places like Sevres and other places like Ahmed, which is in Diyarbakir and that, which have been the target of Turkish security forces. And they have been rampaging across that area for a long time. They've removed, for example, HDP ministers. Like they've continued to target, for example, Demirtaş's party, who's of course the HDP, the People's Party. Yeah. So it's Kurds don't have a good time anymore. I mean, there was a brief period where Kurds, where Kurdish channels were being allowed in Turkey, and there was this idea that okay, things were looking up for Kurds in the region. Erdogan has kind of changed that ever since his consolidation of power. So yeah. Okay. Sean, what would a head-on fight between the SDF and the Assad regime look like? With no international backers, who would win? Ooh, that's the thing about it, the Assad regime still has an air force and still has heavy artillery. So, I think, well, the SDF is good at urban conflict and good at guerrilla tactics, like almost asymmetric warfare. There would be you could say that the Assad regime would get the edge initially, but it would not be the same fight as with the opposition, the SNA, essentially. You would still have a great deal of pushback against the regime. I think that the regime would there would be a stalemate between the two. That's part of the reason why the Assad regime doesn't really want to take the northeast yet, without some form of international backing, especially from Russia and Iran, because part of the reason why, for example, remember those initial days of the Rojava revolution, the Syrian government's forces were pushed out of Afrin and Gerispi and Serkania and all that kind of stuff. They were pushed out, not just because of the fight in the northwest, but because they couldn't muster the numbers to quell the Kurdish rebellion in the northeast. So there was this tacit agreement that, okay, we'll leave you alone, but you don't fight us, basically. It's still tacit today. Okay. Mass creation broadcast talks about, I think some people might run into my problem. I'm not very well informed on the subject. I don't know what to ask. It's okay, man. I mean, you maybe just ask me simple questions on that. I don't mind teaching people. I mean, whole point of these podcasts at the end of the day is to try maybe give some people a little bit of knowledge that they didn't have. I mean, I'm by far no expert on everything. You know what I mean? I don't claim to be an expert. I think that if anything, at the moment, I'm doing my best as an amateur. I source the stuff that I say, and I am studying this area, but I don't like the title of expert or that. So I always come to it as an educator or someone to try and to inform people about what's going on in the region, because I think it's very important what's happening in the region. I think more people need to know about it, essentially. Okay. Agara Sheve asked me, do you know Ahmed or HDP? I know both. I know people who support HDP. I know Turkish Kurds as well. You could say Kurds from Bakur. I know Kurds from Bakur, which is, you could say northern Kurdistan, like that in Kurdish language. Okay, Jaeger asks, do you want to go to Rojava? What would be the best way to do it? Because of it being a war, is there certain hoops to jump through to get there? I try my best to go to places where I know I will be safe, and I'm sure that I'll be safe in Rojava. But I don't want to burden them essentially with my presence there, because they're already facing a fight, especially with Turkey. When I went to, for example, Bashur, which is southern Kurdistan in Iraqi Kurdistan, when I went there, I wanted to initially go to Rojava. I wanted to go at that time. I won't tell you exactly how they do things, because I want to maintain sort of the secrecy in that. So I wanted to go to Rojava and, to see the area. But at that time, it had just been that Turkey had invaded with Operation Peace Spring. And I don't want to burden these locals with my presence. I don't want to be like that foreigner basically who's doing war tourism, essentially. The Kurdistan region is safe, especially in Bashur, or southern Kurdistan, or otherwise known as Iraqi Kurdistan. It's fine there because they have a security apparatus there that maintains security over there and maintains some semblance of orders, despite, of course, the corruption that's going on at the moment, the arrest of some journalists in Bashur as well, and the other security operations that are going on within that area as well, which that's another talk for another day. Okay, let's see. What would be the best way to do it? Because of being wars, there's certain hoops. You got to go through a bunch of hoops essentially for anything. You got to have a fixer first of all. You need to know people from the region who can kind of liaison with you, with locals. Like, unless you know Kurdish expertly, like my Kurmanji and Zorani is not that good. I mean, I'm still learning, but I can say a couple things here and there. Like, one of the words I learned in Kurdish, and one of the words I kept with me all my time there was the babura. Babura is sorry in Zorani. So if you know, like, for example, you say slow, and you say, kind of like Rojbash or Salam Ketin. You go to things like Choni, Bashi, and all that kind of stuff. Basic things to get you around, but it's not a lot. You need like actual fixer there, because at the moment you go into more complicated areas like military sites or even security checkpoints, that's when you actually have to know the local language. You need to not be stupid, essentially, because at the end of the day, they're not there to target you, but they want to simply protect their people. Yeah. Yep, okay. Yes, Bakur Kurdistan. Yeah, yep. Bashur Kurdistan. Yeah. What do you think about the recent air strikes based around Syria? For those who don't know, Israel has actually been targeting Syrian military sites throughout the course of the war. Part of the reason is to try curtail Iraq Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps activity in the region, because the IRGC, as it's called, is using Syria as a platform to get into Lebanon and to attack Israel. So Israel at the moment is trying to prevent Iran from building its ICBM program and from actually building a nuclear weapon, essentially, at the moment. So Israel has been targeting areas mostly Abu Bukamal in the northeast. It's if I'll go back to my Syria map. So you see on the Syria map over here, if you look towards the Euphrates River, just by Deir Zur Airport and Deir Zur City. This is a map from, I think, 2009 or something like that. Just if you go south from Deir Zur down the river, you're going to see a little town called Abu Kamal, al-Bukamal. That's where a lot of RGC paramilitaries are. Most of the strikes that Israel has been doing have either been near Damascus or they've been near al-Bukamal, because there's a huge Iranian epicenter there, like Iranian paramilitaries that are going into Syria from there. Because the Americans have a base in Al-Tanf, which is a bit further south, and they also have military bases in Hasakah and that, but the Israelis have been striking RGC positions, military sites, for the last 5 or so years in the Syrian conflict. Okay. So, if there's any more, I can answer more questions if anyone's got them. Yeah, so, let's see. If you got any more of the questions to ask, if not, I can always sign off, and you could always contact me. So anyway, I'll sign off. That's what I'll do. Okay. So, thank you for listening to another Through the Looking Glass, or TTLG, episode 3, what should be done about Arab nationalism in Syria. You've been with Anthony Avisto-Bisson, who I am a contributor to the Jerusalem Post, Arab Magazine, and the region. I focus on a lot of the Middle East, specifically on minority rights and conflict in the region. You can find me at stokeviper.com, so at capital S, lowercase TOIC, capital V, lowercase IPER on Twitter. You could also go look up my website, philosophyismagic.com. That's also where I upload my recent articles, as well as archive the articles I have written for other sites as well. I'll also be including all the sources that I've used in the description box below once I have completed this episode and wrapped it up. And I'll also timestamp it for convenience for later. So thank you so much, all of you, for listening to me. And I don't know how long it's been. Hopefully I'll try to keep this a bit shorter than... I think I may have kept it shorter than 2 hours, hopefully. But with that said, thank you for listening, and have a good day.